Welcome to the Dick Arboretum of the Plains 2021 Native Plant School class. This class is called Starting a Native Plant Garden. My name is Scott Vogt. I'm the Executive Director here at the Arboretum. I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to sign up for some of the other classes that we have coming up this year, later over the next several months. The next one is next Wednesday, January 20th, with Brad Gore, Education Coordinator, on the mighty oaks. Go to our website online, click on attend events, and then register for the remaining Native Plant School classes. As we go through this presentation, I'd encourage you to, if you have questions, click on the chat button at the bottom of the screen and type in your questions. If you want to review this class, we'll be sending out a recording of this class to you in the next several days. If you think of other questions after the fact, after we've left this evening, then you can send those questions to my email address, which is on this first slide at the bottom of the screen there. Or if you're interested in a landscape consultation with myself or with Katie Schmidt, or our horticulturist grounds manager, you could send us an email and we can figure out a way we can get together and look at your landscape together. If, as many of you know, this presentation is for, many of you are attending from South Central Kansas, but there are those who are attending from outside of the state of Kansas. Your plant palette may be a little bit different than what I'm recommending in this presentation, but a lot of the design principles and concepts are the same. So I encourage you to take those into consideration and as you think about what plants to incorporate into your own landscape. So let's go ahead and get started. Starting a native plant garden. Where are native plants appropriate? And just about any place that you can think of is appropriate for native plants. One of the more difficult and more challenging areas, obviously, is in shaded areas, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the presentation. But homes, schools, businesses, houses of worship, medical centers, just about any place that you can think of can be a great place to incorporate native plants. Oftentimes, the driving factors and why many of you are interested in starting native plant gardens is you want to spend less time managing your garden, maintaining your garden, and more time enjoying it. There's certainly a growing interest in environmental gardens, gardens that positively affect the environment. Use of less chemicals, less water, less herbicides, pesticides, those kinds of things are really driving this interest in native plants. But also this idea that we can play a part in changing some of the degradation and habitat loss that is going on around us. This positively then affects the pollinators and other wildlife that we attract to our garden. I just visited with somebody the other day who was amazed at how their yard had changed as they began to incorporate native plants and trees and shrubs with flowers and fruit that the birds enjoyed. And they're really reaping the benefits of having these native plants within their garden. Certainly aesthetics, we all have our preferences and what we want to include into our gardens, masses and drifts of color, texture, plants that are appealing to our senses. There's interest in growing native plants even in smaller spaces. Having these gardens used throughout the day and into the night, having these outdoor spaces, these outdoor rooms that are being utilized for grilling, for having a fire pit, for gathering together as a family. These are all important spaces. One of the things that we need to think about too is making sure that we still have usable space, you know, places for children to run, for dogs to run, those kinds of things. I'm not against turf per se, but I think you have to think strategically about where those turf areas are and then use native plants to fill in the remainder of your landscape. Native plants certainly deliver carefree beauty once they're established, but they're not maintenance free. They require less care and watering. They're adapted to our soils and climate. Obviously, they attract birds and butterflies because those insects, pollinators, and birds have utilized these native plants more so than they ever would adaptable perennials. And then there's this idea of solution gardening, solving landscape problems with native plants. Maybe it's a dry area in your yard, maybe it's a wet area in your yard, but certainly this idea that native plants can solve some of the problems, some of the problem areas within your landscape. As we think about these native plants, I always like to show this slide because it really demonstrates why these plants are so resilient, so drought tolerant in our Kansas climate. They have deep root systems, fibrous root systems, and I'll allude to this slide later on in the presentation when we talk about matrix planting, but these plants are widely distributed and have extensive root systems that help them sustain prolonged periods of drought. Back in 2011, 2012, I was amazed at how these plants survived, even bloomed after 50-some days of 100-degree temperatures. In the fall, we had asters and goldenrods and blue sage, and even some of the native grasses were thriving, and it all has to do with the root systems that these plants have. So when I think about starting a native plant garden, certainly I consider natives first, but the starting point for me always is evaluating the site. What kind of soil do I have? What kind of sun conditions do I have? Is it stay dry in the summer and wet in the spring and fall? Is my neighbor overwatering his yard and I have areas that stay consistently moist? Is my soil sandy? Is it a heavy clay? All these things need to be considered and need to be evaluated, not just now at a certain point, but throughout the year. Does the sun change? The amount of sunlight change for the area that you want to develop at different times of the year? Certainly now it's getting more sunlight than it would during because the tree canopy is open, or you have to look at all of these considerations, look at all of these characteristics of your area, of your site, and that will begin to help you formulate what kinds of plants need to be incorporated into your design. Typically, most prairie plants need at least 6 hours of direct sunlight. This will also help figure out and orient maybe where your area, maybe where your garden is going to be situated. Partial shade, there's another plant palette grouping of plants that can handle some, say, from 3 to 6 hours of direct sunlight. And then are you in more of a shady situation and you have to look more towards shade or savanna type plants. But really look at your area critically, begin to evaluate it, keep track of what's happening, and then that will help determine as you move forward what plants to incorporate within your design. Soil preparation, typically I'm not a big proponent of adding any kind of organic matter or compost to your garden. Again, there is a plant palette. There is a group of plants that can even grow in our heavy clay soils like we have here in Harvey County, or sandy soil plants, or really dry conditions. So amending soil really does more harm than good when we're talking about native plants. Typically, you'll get a lot of extensive top growth, but there isn't a sustaining root system there to to keep those plants growing. So I really don't encourage a lot of soil amendments, adding organic matter, unless it's a really, really sandy soil. But even then, there's a group of plants that can grow in those kinds of conditions. The other thing to think about is controlling perennial weeds, bindweed, Bermuda grass, getting those under control. I've made the mistake time and time again, and I wish I hadn't made these mistakes, because I go in and rush getting an area planted before I have these weeds under control. And I learned my lesson over the years that even if it's means waiting another 3 to 6 months before I plant or begin to install my native plant garden, you'll be more successful if you have these weeds under control. So really encourage you to look at what kind of problem weeds you have, perennial weeds, and then eradicating those. In the case of bindweed and Bermuda grass, you use Roundup, several applications of Roundup, usually in the late summer and early fall is the best time to control these. They have extensive root systems, and then if you do that kind of control, usually you can plant then the next spring. Just really encourage you to get these problematic weeds under control before you begin to install your native plant garden. The other thing to consider is, where will you be looking at this site from? How will you be using this area? Will it be an island planting like the picture there on top, where the plants are centered, the taller plants in the center radiate into shorter plants in the around the peripheral? Will you be looking at this from your kitchen window, dining room, living room? And so then the taller plants then would be in the back, with medium plants there in front of those and shorter plants. It just helps you orient the plants that you're going to include within your design. Laying out the paths is really important. How you're going to be thinking about how you're going to be utilizing. Is this going to be more of a naturalistic planting, habitat planting, versus a more formal planting, more prairie-esque versus more formal, where it's laid out in groupings of wildflowers and grasses? Is there going to be sitting areas, fire pits, arbors? Is this a path to a garden shed? All of those are important things to think about as you begin to initiate the process of developing a plan. How are you going to be utilizing this space is really, really important. Lay out your paths, and then you can then think about the heights of your plants that you want to include within your design. So plant selection. We'll be talking a little bit more about these. Match the site, succession of bloom, design a 4-season garden, follow the 70% rule, think about interesting lines, edging, paths, and then employ the matrix planting. So plant selection. After you've evaluated your site, there is a plant palette, a group of plants that will fit your site, that will grow well in your site. Here's an example of 2 that will not grow well together. Swamp milkweed needs consistently moist soil. We have it around our pond. It blooms every late summer. Monarchs utilize it as they're migrating through, going south, but it needs consistently moist soil. Evening primrose. This grows in rocky hillsides, exposed sites, dry areas. You can't grow these together. They have 2 separate. One will be happy, one will die. You'll either overwater or underwater. It's really important to match the plants up with the site that you have. Think about where these plants grow in community with one another. What other plants grow well with, say, primrose, or grow well with swamp milkweed? And then if you have a wet site, match those plants that can handle those kinds of moisture conditions together. If you have a drier site, match those plants that can handle consistently dry or drying conditions throughout the growing season. Think about succession of bloom. If you go to the prairie, if you go to the Konza Prairie, if you go to Maxwell Game Preserve, at various times throughout the year, you won't see the same plant blooming at different times of the year. You have the succession of bloom, plants coming into bloom, going out of bloom throughout the whole growing season, spring, summer, fall, and then the native grasses incorporate into your design, add color and texture, movement in the winter months. Fall have beautiful fall color as well. But plan for succession of bloom, and how you incorporate these then within your design. Obviously, you wouldn't want to group some plants that next to one another that bloom just in the summer, like the butterfly milkweed, and you want to have a spring bloomer, say, next to a fall bloomer, next to a summer bloomer. You have this plants coming into bloom, going out of bloom throughout the whole growing season, and there's a succession of bloom. But it helps as you think about laying out your plants and in grouping those plants together, that you think critically about when those plants bloom and then incorporating those in such a way that you don't have two of the same bloom periods right next to each other within the design. I hope that makes sense. The other thing to think about, and it's often overlooked because we're so interested in bloom and the aesthetics, but we need to really think about what these plants look like, not only when they're in bloom, but after they're done blooming. Is there interesting seed heads? Do they have good fall color? What do they look like as they're emerging in the spring? Can you highlight some of these interesting seed heads with the backdrop of native grasses? Swaths of color. After those plants are done blooming, some of those native grasses can be incorporated in such a way that can really highlight, kind of give you movement within the garden as well. Here's coneflower with little blue stem, those dark seed heads of pale coneflower with the backdrop of little blue stem. Amsonia, one of my favorite plants, because it has so many different seasons of interest, from spring bloom to interesting, nice dark green, drought-tolerant foliage to yellow fall color, this butter yellow fall color. This is Amsonia eubrectii, or threadleaf blue star. But think about what these plants look, and so that it helps you incorporate them in such a way you can even highlight some of the seed heads, different textures within the design. The other thing to think about is the 70% structure plants. And this can be taller perennials, grasses, some of your native grasses, like some of the switch grasses, like little blue stem, like blonde ambition, blue grama grass. These are great structure plants. They look good throughout the whole growing season, add color and texture, but they kind of anchor the whole planting, and then incorporating 30% of these aesthetic plants, these pops of color, such as coneflowers, for instance, like a colorful red or pink coneflower. Or black-eyed Susan is another example of filler plants that give you these pops of color, but the whole planting then is anchored by these structure plants, which really give you consistent color, consistent growth, kind of anchor the whole planting, and then filling it with some of these filler plants that give you pops of color at various times throughout the year. And this is really important when you think about succession of bloom. Some other filler plants may be some of the asters. They really don't do much. They hold and grow and have nice structure, form, but then they burst to color into bloom later in the season, usually in September and October. And those would be, whether that's October Skies aster, Radon's favorite aster. There's lots of different kinds of asters that can be incorporated within a design. Those would also be good structural plants. Going back to the slide that we talked about towards the beginning, think about the roots of these plants. And this is where we're beginning to incorporate and think about layers of plants or matrix planting. And there's really, in any prairie, there's the structural layer. It can be trees, shrubs, taller perennials, grasses. That's what I just got through talking about. This is kind of the majority of the plants within the design. And then you have these companion plants or seasonal theme layers like coneflowers, liatras, black-eyed Susans that add interest at different times throughout the growing season. And then you have the ground cover layer. This layer works like a mulch to suppress weeds and eliminates the use of mulch. And this is a new concept that we've been trying here at the Arboretum over the last several years. From this book called Planting in a Post-Wild World is where we got the idea. And it really mimics what is happening on the prairie. Plants in the ground cover layer typically don't have very deep roots, more in the top 12 to 18 inches. The seasonal theme layer, they have kind of medium 3 to 4 foot deep roots. And then the structural layer plants have deeper, more taprooted plants. And this is what's happening in the prairie as well. These plants are not in competition with one another because their root zones are at different layers of the soil profile. And so they can grow in harmony with minimal input, especially if you've done a good job of matching your plants up at the site that you have. It's really important to think about the structural layer, seasonal theme layer, and ground cover layer, and then working those plants in such a way that they're not in competition with one another. There's also a couple other layers that you can think of. The vertical layer, those are vines and climbers. You see those on arbors. The filler layer, the short-lived plants and bulbs that can be scattered throughout and add spontaneous or seasonal interest. But the main layers are the structural layer, seasonal theme layer, and ground cover layer. And typically there is 3 layers of plants with at least 3 layers of plants, and they all fit into this kind of matrix planting formula. This plays into differing heights. When I lay out a design, say for a foundation planting, I typically look at 3 to 4 layers of plants. So foundation of, say, a front porch or along a house, there's, depending on the size of the bed, usually there's a layer of plants that get 4 to 5 feet tall. The next layer is 24 to 48 inches, and then the next layer closest to the plant, closest to the edging, is 12 to 18 inches, maybe 10 to 18 inches in height. But there's 3 distinct layers. Then if there's trees as a backdrop or overlook, overstory, then you would have more than that. But typically within a design, it's 3 to 4 layers of plants, and there's this tiered look to the overall design. I hope that makes sense. But visible patterns, this is a good example. The shorter plants there in the front working towards the taller grasses. Looks like switchgrass there in the back. But there's 3 or 4 different distinct layers within this, with some grasses incorporated with some of the perennials. But it all works cohesively together. It's really important to think about scale. Typically, scale of a landscape design is putting plants in that are half the bed width. So if your bed width is 8 foot wide, keeping plants in scale would be plants that are 4 foot tall at the most. This is compass plant, can get 8 to 10 feet tall, but this would not work great in a design, say, of a 2 or 3 foot wide bed. It'll flop over, be in a walkway, cause problems. Just will not be happy in that kind of environment, and you won't be happy with it either. So really looking at scale and keeping plants in scale, it's half the bed width. Thinking of interesting lines, edging, keeping a clean edge, can be rock edging, can be metal edging, can be, as in this picture, a nice clean edge with of the lawn. But lines help kind of lead people through, and this could be a path as well as a lawn. But you want to see what's around the corner there, and it helps lead people through your garden, through your landscape. So think about how you're going to edge this this design, whether it's going to be with railroad ties or limestone edging, landscaping, timbers, but whatever it is, it looks intentional, kind of gives a break between the lawn and the overall design, but it's really important to have some kind of edging there. But looking at this, as this line of this design leads your eye, and you want to follow it and see what is around the corner there. And it may be an arbor, it may be a gazing ball, whatever it may be. You want to, your eye is led throughout the whole garden design. So after you've thought about all those principles and you have kind of an understanding of the plants that you want to incorporate within your design, there's great material within our native plant guide, the National Wildlife Federation, their plant finder website helps you identify which plants would grow well in your region as well. But once you've figured out what plants you want to incorporate within your design, you've laid out your plants, plotted those on your design paper, then you can go ahead and start laying out. And this is just an example of an area that we did here at the Visitor Center. We laid the entire bed out. Then we could step back and look at the spacing, thinking about what these plants will ultimately grow to be at maturity. And then we begin to plant them after we've got the proper spacing. And then don't plant them too deep. Typically with native plants, especially if you have heavy clay soil, it's better to plant them just a little bit high than too deep. Mulch lightly, but with the matrix planting, you don't have to mulch. Shouldn't be using as much mulch, especially if you've grouped your plants as densely as you could. Avoid fertilization. We talked a little bit about that at soil preparation. Too much fertilizer, too much organic matter encourages a lot of top growth, and it usually takes 3 to 5 years for those root systems that we saw in that one of those original slides to develop. And so you have a lot of top growth that is not going to be able to be sustained by an immature root system, especially for those first couple of years. So avoid fertilization if at all possible. And then water daily until established. And I like to use a hand water, a wand. Then I can count off 1,001, 1,002 for each plant. I know that they're getting watered. And then once you start to see that they have some new growth on them, they're beginning to get established to their surroundings, you can back off on watering every other day or every third day. Check periodically for weeds, keep those in check, for moisture, and for pests. You can spray those with Roundup, being very cautious, or you can hand pull any weeds that come up. And then cut back each spring 2 to 4 inches. And we'll be doing that here at the Arboretum with some of our flower beds here in the next few months, cutting our flower beds back to 2 to 4 inches. Water through periods of prolonged drought. Again, it takes at least 2 years, maybe 3 to 5 years for those root systems to be developed. So for those first couple years, you may have to give periodic water. But if you've done a good job of matching the plants up with the site that you have, then you should be in good shape. I hope this all makes sense, but it's really important. Probably the most critical aspect of any garden design is matching the plants up with the site that you have. When you don't do that, there will always be one plant, kind of an indicator plant, that may start, it may not be happy, starts wilting before any of the other plants within the design. So, trying to match up as close as you can with the site that you have is really, really the most important component of a successful design. So let's go ahead and we'll go through these wildflowers really quickly. This is butterfly milkweed blooming here at the Arboretum. But yarrow, we'll go through these. These are in alphabetical order by scientific name. Yarrow, different kinds of yarrow, frilly foliage. There's white forms, terracotta, pink, yellow, great for spring bloom. Will slowly spread, can take some partial shade, fairly drought tolerant once you get them established, but usually they're between 12 and 18 inches tall. Blue Star, Amsonia tabernae montana, blue ice. This is a shorter form of Amsonia or Blue Star. It's maybe 12 to 18 inches tall, works well with in the front of a border. Blue flowers in the springtime, and then has a nice butter yellow fall color. Arkansas Blue Star, Amsonia hubrectii, another nice one that we use from time to time that has a little bit wider leaves is Amsonia illustris. But Amsonia hubrectii has light blue flowers, finer foliage, and then planting these in mass can be really spectacular with the butter yellow fall color that they have. Asclepias tuberosa, and there's really a lot of interest in helping the monarch populations. And one of the things that you can do, that we all can do within our design, is incorporate more milkweeds within the design. This is probably one of the most recognizable of our prairie plants because of those beautiful orange flowers. But there's other forms. There's common milkweed, Sullivan's milkweed, world milkweed, lots of different forms of milkweed. Just have to be really careful with some of these other forms because they do spread and can take over. So some of the more beneficial milkweeds that monarchs prefer even over butterfly milkweed may not be the best for a formal bed, but certainly would be options for areas that in the peripheral of your gardens, in areas where they can spread on their own, maybe be kept in check with some native grasses. But monarchs prefer a lot of these other more wild forms, spreading forms, because they have bigger leaves that the monarch caterpillars can lay egg, can eat on, and that the adults can lay eggs on. But certainly should include more milkweeds within your design if you can. Aromatic aster, the October skies, light lavender blooms in September and October. This forms a nice mound. This is one of those structural plants that you want to include within your design if you can. because it looks good as a nice mounded plant, and then it bursts into bloom later in the season with gets maybe 2 foot by 2 foot in diameter. Another one to think about including is radon's favorite. It has a little bit darker blooms, gets a little bit taller, will slowly spread and fill in an area, but it has, in my mind, a little bit more attractive flower, a little bit darker bloom, but pollinators love these late in the season. Dwarf wild indigo, Baptisia australis variety minor, blooms in the springtime, long lived, so make sure when you plant these that it's not going to be moved. Root systems are fairly extensive, fairly deep, can get 10 to 15 feet deep, but they're fairly long-lived. We've had some here at the Arboretum in the same spot for decades, and they just keep coming back year after year. Blooms in the springtime with these pea-like blooms, and then develops kind of a tannish, dark brown seed pod cluster late in the season. Different forms of Baptisia. These get a little bit taller than our true native form, but from yellows to light lavender to dark purple, all kinds of different forms that are really great and add structure. This would be another structural plant within your design. Purple poppy mallow, this is more plant that would grow in the ground cover level. We talk about matrix planting. Slowly spreads and has blooms with these cup type blooms in the springtime, dissected foliage, more of a spreader, can spill over rock walls. It's really attractive and eye-catching in the springtime when it's in bloom. Has a tendency sometimes to go dormant, especially if it's really, really dry. That's why it works well and kind of in that ground cover layer, because it can be covered up by some of the taller perennials later after it's done blooming. Different kinds of coreopsis. This is Coreopsis lanceolata, Jethro Tull. Can be deadheaded for repeat bloom. Blooms in late spring, early summer. Can bloom over several months if you keep deadheading it. But it really pops in the landscape because of these bright yellow blooms. Purple prairie clover, Dahlia purpurea. Finger-like foliage. Frilly blooms, very drought tolerant. It's a legume. Blooms in July and August at the hottest part of the summer when a lot of other plants are not in bloom. So it's one that can really add some interest within a garden design. This would be one you'd want to incorporate with some other grasses, say such as prairie dropseed or blue grama, blonde ambition. Side oats grama, little blue stem. These grow in community with a lot of those shorter kind of mixed grass prairie plants. Lots of different kinds of coneflower. The most widely distributed of our native coneflower is narrowleaf coneflower, Echinacea angustifolia, found in the western 4/5 of the state, 18 to 24 inches tall, blooms in May and June. Light pink blooms, again, likes a drier soil, exposed sites, full sun for best growth. Does not appreciate a lot of heavy organic matter. Will survive in our clay soils as long as the water can get away from the crowns of the plants. Pale coneflower, longer ray petals, gets a little bit taller, member of the tallgrass prairie, 3 to 4 feet tall, again blooms in May and June, but has longer ray petals, gets quite a bit taller than the narrowleaf coneflower. And then of course the yellow-purple coneflower, Echinacea paradoxa, has yellow blooms. And sometimes you can find yellow coneflower and pale coneflower blooming simultaneously in the same prairie, which can be very, very striking. But again, all of these coneflowers require pretty good drainage, keeping moisture away, especially winter moisture away from the crowns of these plants. And there's lots of different forms. One thing I will say, as in this supreme cantaloupe, these are double blooms, not as attractive to pollinators as the single blooms such as the sunrise or even some of the native forms. These new coneflower varieties can be spectacular, can really add some pops of color, and should be included within your landscape design. One thing that people are finding out is that they don't overwinter as well, and really encourage you to, in August, September, begin to cut the blooms off, and that forces those plants, rather than producing more blooms, it forces them to root in. So it makes them a little bit more long-lived within the garden. Rattlesnake Master should be utilized in garden designs more as a structural plant, because it looks good throughout the growing season and even when it's in bloom. Eryngium yuccifolium, because the foliage looks just like a yucca plant, has these kind of silvery white blooms in the summer months, 3 to 4 feet tall, but a nice plant that should be included and utilized more within the garden design. Looks very similar to a kind of a purplish plant that is found in the nursery trade of sea holly, but this is our native form, Eryngium yuccifolium. Joe Pieweed gets 5 to 6 feet tall, likes a more consistently moist soil, used as a backdrop or a structural plant in an area that stays more consistently moist, can take some partial shade. Pollinators flock to this plant when it's in bloom. There is shorter forms like Little Joe, but a plant that needs more consistent moisture, can take some partial shade, some morning sun, afternoon shade, kind of a situation. But in our climate here in south central Kansas, needs a little more consistently moist soil. Helen's flower, a native form found in more prairie seeps, areas that stay again consistently moist, blooms in the late summer, early fall. There's yellow forms, there's orange forms, there's red forms. The true native form that you see most often out in the wild is the yellow form, but a plant that again needs more consistently moist soil, but and again can take some partial sun. Different kinds of blazing star, and there's literally a blazing star for just about every kind of garden situation, landscape situation, whether it's wet, dry, tall, short. There is a liatris, there is a form that can grow in those kinds of conditions. You just have to kind of explore and experiment. This is button blazing star, needs more consistently dry soil, blooms in the late summer here in south central Kansas, but a shorter form, again, that needs more drier conditions is dotted gay feather, Liatris mucronata, Liatris punctata. Only get maybe 18 to 24 inches tall. Again, bloom later in the season. Kansas gay feather, a little more adaptable, can go from wet to a little bit more on the drier side. The picture there on the left is it growing next to our pond here at the Arboretum. And these are best also planted in mass. One of them just doesn't look good by itself. And you can plant these relatively close to one another. There's probably 30 plants within a 3 to 4 feet square area here, and to get that kind of look. The yellow bloom there is gray-headed coneflower, and that's one that you would want to put in the peripheral, not in more of a formal bed, because it has a tendency to self-seed and be very prolific in spreading by seed. The pollinators all love these blazing stars. Wild bee balm and artificialosa is another one that you could incorporate with your different various kinds of problematic spreading milkweed. Pollinators love it. Can be bees, native bees, flies, but will spread, and is not really appropriate for a formal planting, but in these peripheral areas where it can let it fight it out with some of the native grasses, common milkweed, for instance, it will do just fine. And pollinators just flock to these plants when they're in bloom. Evening primrose, Enithera macrocarpa. See it along the rock walkway, spilling over rock walls. Blooms in the springtime and then sporadically through the rest of the growing season. In nature, out in the wild, you see these out on exposed sites, rocky hillsides, windswept hills, and they're just thriving in that kind of environment. So you want to put this in an area where it's going to not stay too wet. The death of these plants is that it's going to get too wet and the crowns begin to rot, especially during the winter months. So in areas here at the Arboretum, we have them in raised beds. We have them in a sandy loam soil where that's quick draining, so that winter snows, the water can get away from those crowns, and you don't have as much problem with kind of crown rot. But beautiful plant that is very long-lived if it finds a happy place within your landscape. Smooth penstemon, Penstemon digitalis. This is a variety called dark towers, whitish pink blooms, more burgundy foliage. This is a structural plant that looks good not only when it's in bloom, but later in the season with these dark burgundy stems. Pollinators love it. It's really fun to watch these bumblebees crawl into these tubular flowers. We see hummingbirds on these every spring, and they're very long-lived. Again, they need a little more quick draining soil, but this is probably one of the more adaptable of our native penstemon. It can even grow in our clay soils, but doesn't like to be in areas that are really stay consistently moist. Prairie phlox, Phlox pilosa, slowly spread, pink blooms in the springtime, and you see this out in the prairie mixed with some of the prairie grasses. Can grow in areas that are a little more moist, can grow in areas that are a little bit dry. It's quite adaptable, but these pink flowers in the springtime are very attractive. Missouri Black-Eyed Susan, this is a true perennial. It comes back year after year for us here at the Arboretum. Rudbeckia missouriensis blooms in July and August, forms a nice upright plant that has these striking yellow blooms, but it's really attractive in the summer months. Blue sage, Salvia azureum. This is one of those plants that I mentioned earlier in the droughts of 2011, 2012. These plants were blooming in the fall in our prairie, and it just shows how resilient they are. But it has these sky blue flowers. It's kind of a wispy plant, needs to be propped up by other grasses or other perennials. But when these are in bloom, the pollinators just flock to these plants. And they actually have to pry those flowers open to get to the nectar at the back of the flower. But it's really fun to watch the pollinators work on these plants. Cup plant, more of a backdrop plant. This is one that's more for the peripheral areas of your garden. It gets rather tall, can get 6 to 8 feet tall, has these blue flowers, and it will even kind of spread by seed. but it gets its name because the flowers actually form a cup around the stem and can work as a natural bird bath. But you see it here on the left with some Missouri black-eyed Susan, some sage, some ornamental onion, and Missouri black-eyed Susan. Prairie dock, Silphium terebinthinaceum. I call this the hosta of the prairie. Wide foliage, beautiful plant, but it's one that, again, you want to make sure you don't put this in a more formal bed, or you cut the stems back after it's done blooming, because it will vigorously self-seed and take over a garden setting. So again, one of those plants that's beautiful. It has its place in the landscape, but maybe not so much in a formal bed. There may be other alternative plants to incorporate, but I love this if nothing else, I would incorporate this just because of the foliage this plant has. Puts up this leafless stem that can get 6 to 8 feet tall and has these beautiful yellow blooms in the summer months. Gray goldenrod, any of the goldenrods are great. They get a bad rap because they're blooming at the same time as our giant ragweed, which has yellow pollen. These are insect pollinated and should be incorporated within the landscape more, landscape designs more, just because of the pollinators that they attract to our landscape, especially later in the season. When ours are in bloom, they're just covered with all sorts of bees, butterflies working on them. These plants just come alive when they're in bloom. Get 2 to 3 feet tall. This is gray goldenrod. Rigid goldenrod is another good one, more upright, more flat-topped in bloom. But goldenrod should be utilized more in the landscape. Another filler plant, one that we utilize here at the Arboretum quite a bit, is Solidago rugosa fireworks, and those are more of a structural plant that bloom again late in the season, 3 to 4 feet tall. But use goldenrods. Goldenrods should be used more than they currently are. Ohio spiderwort, Tritoscantia ohioensis, blooms in the springtime. Gets a new flower every morning. Pollinators love these, work on these. There's lavender, there's pink, there's almost whitish blooms. But these spiderworts are great. They can grow in also partial shade situations, so they're quite adaptable and will slowly over time spread, but they're not aggressive. 2 to 3 feet tall, maybe at the most. Rose verbena, Verbena canadensis. You see this in rocky outcroppings in the Flint Hills, so you know that it needs more consistently drier. Too much moisture and it's not going to be happy. Too much fertility and it's not going to be happy. Blooms in the springtime, and then if we get some late season rains, it may repeat bloom later in August, September. But most of the bloom is concentrated in the spring months. One that we've been utilizing here, a plant that we've been utilizing here at the Arboretum over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, is this Letterman's iron plant, Vernonia lettermanii, iron butterflies. This is kind of the opposite as far as bloom time of the Amsonia hubrectii. A little bit darker purple blooms, but still has a nice fine foliage. This is a great structural plant. Thinking of structural plants that we talked about with the matrix planting, this would be one of those plants because it looks good when it's in bloom, but throughout the whole growing season. It's kind of one of those plants that can anchor a entire sunny planting. And that's something I should have mentioned at the very beginning, is that most of these plants need at least 6 hours of direct sunlight. And I've gone through and I've mentioned the ones that can handle a little more shade, but most of these plants need a little more consistently moist, 6 hours of least direct sunlight to be happy. Zizia or Golden Alexander, this is a savanna plant, kind of an understory plant. Can grow in full sun, but prefers morning sun, afternoon shade, protected from the hottest part of the day. Yellow blooms in the springtime. It's a member of the parsley family, and so swallowtails just love this plant. The caterpillars will just munch these down to the ground. But nice plant for spring bloom. Some native grasses. So quickly as we keep going through these, big blue stem Andropogon gerardii, turkey foot grass, great fall color, 4 to 5 feet tall. There's consistent forms like Red October or rain dance. There's lots of great forms out there, a big blue stem that give you more consistently good fall color, but plant that should be used as a backdrop for some of the other more medium perennials. Switchgrass, Northwind is one of my favorites, Cheyenne Sky, because of the red leaves that it has. Shenandoah is another red leaf form. The Northwind is 4 to 5 feet tall, consistently upright, will not flop over. One of those plants that's great for a backdrop. Cheyenne Sky gets maybe only 3 foot tall, incorporated with some of the native cone flowers or black-eyed Susan, and can really highlight then the seed heads later in the season. Little blue stem, Schizocarium sciparium. There's Twilight Zone is one of my favorites that has come out in the last several years. There's Blue Heaven, which is what the one on the left there is, but all have great fall color and get about 3 to 4 feet tall. Indian grass, Sargastrum nutans, tannish seed heads, late in the season, more vase shape, 4 to 5 feet tall. Incorporated with some of your taller perennials like the Solidago Fireworks or some of the taller Baptisia really look good for the back part of a garden design. And then Prairie Dropseed is a great one for the front of a bed. Looks like a fountain grass, but the seed heads are not so dense that you can't see through them. Quite adaptable from full sun to part shade. Another one that I don't have listed here that I really like is Blue Grama, a variety called Blonde Ambition. So quickly, some shade plants. This is woodland phlox. Some of the spring ephemerals. One of the difficulties that we have with growing shade here in south central Kansas or in our area here is that you have to think about what was originally here. Essentially, you're trying to grow shade plants in an area that was predominantly for prairie plants. So not as deep rooted, not as consistently moist situations as you get into an eastern Kansas even. So in order to grow some of these and for them to kind of begin to proliferate and spread, you're going to have to add from time to time moisture. Moisture is the limiting factor to a lot of the shade gardening that we try to do here in south central Kansas. So some of the spring ephemerals, bloodroot, spring beauty, jack in the pulpit, anemone, shooting star. This is jack in the pulpit. This is some of the anemones. This is a shooting star. This is the yellow wood poppy. And these are all spring ephemerals, meaning that they bloom when the canopy is open. The trees aren't leafed out, and they typically begin to go dormant in springtime as the trees are beginning to bud. May apples, blue cohosh, trout lilies. This is May apple. These are all native shade plants, but they're what we consider spring ephemerals, meaning they come up early in the spring and then they disappear later in April and early May. Some other perennials for shade, wild columbine, and there's lots of different kinds of columbine that would work well in a shady situation. 3 to 6 hours of sunlight, dappled shade situations. But our native form has reddish kind of spurs. There is a yellow form of our native columbine called Corbett. But typically, our true native form is red and yellow. White woodland aster, I like this plant. It's found more in eastern United States, but we've had really good success with it. Has white blooms with yellow centers, kind of yellow and raspberry centers in the fall. We have the spring ephemerals, and so you're oftentimes looking for plants that can add interest later in the season, and this is one that we really had success with. It's more of a ground cover, slowly spreads and fills in, kind of weaves with some of your other woodland natives, but it's not aggressive in how it spreads, but maybe only 18 to 24 inches tall. A taller form that has a tendency to self-seed and spread is this Aster cordifolius Avondale, 2 to 3 feet tall, has more of a light pink or light lavender bloom, again later in the season, late in September and October. Wild geranium, spring bloomer, will develop colonies over time. Pinkish lavender blooms in late April and early May. Dissected foliage, but a nice plant that's pretty drought tolerant and quite adaptable, can take a little more sunlight than some of the other shade perennials that we're talking about here. Woodland phlox, to see these plants in their native environment thriving, they're really, really attractive when they're in bloom. Again, it's a weaver that will kind of spread, fill in. Look for numerous varieties of cultivars, Louisiana blue, but all have nice kind of light blue to dark purple blooms in the springtime, and will spread over time slowly. Meadow rue, taller woodland plant, white blooms. There are shrubs like the serviceberry that can grow in some partial shade. Some hydrangeas like the oak leaf hydrangea or the Annabelle hydrangea are some great shrubs. A couple of our native viburnums, such as Viburnum refigilum or Viburnum pruinifolia, can grow in some partial shaded situations, have nice bloom, and then produce fruit. But there's lots of opportunity for incorporating some of these taller native plants within a shade situation. Golden ragwort, Senecio obovatus, yellow blooms in the spring. Again, a weaver that will slowly spread. You could shear these off, and then you have a nice evergreen foliage throughout the rest of the growing season after it's done blooming in the spring. Elm leaf goldenrod, there's several other. Blue stem goldenrod is another one that gives late season bloom. Again, goldenrods get a bad rap, should be utilized in the landscape more than they are, but this is one that can handle some partial shade. Elm leaf goldenrod obviously blooms later in the season, 2 to 3 feet tall. And then shade tolerant sedges, Pennsylvania sedge, Texas sedge, rosy sedge, Appalachian sedge. All of these are nice clump formers. Pennsylvania sedge will slowly spread and fill in an area, but these are nice to incorporate within a shade garden. A couple other grasses to think about is bottle brush grass. That's a nice one. We have river oats in an area that river oats can be problematic, and it's a great native grass if you're able to just kind of let it spread on its own. But if in a more formal garden, more formal shade garden, it will become dominant and crowd out a lot of the other more desirable plants that you want to incorporate. So if you have a slope or a shaded slope or an area for bank stabilization, river oats would be a great option where you can kind of just plant it and let it fill in on its own. It'll spread by seed and by spreading rhizomes, but river oats is not necessarily a great plant for a formal bed, but great for shaded areas such as bank stabilization. So as we come to the end here, just a couple slides. This is Echinacea angustifolia, Engelmann's daisy, common milkweed, and some sedges and some penstemon. The coneflower there with some goldenrod, and then the last slide here of the bald cypress there across the pond. Hope that was helpful to you. Look forward to answering some of your questions. Thank you for participating, and we'll go to the question and answer time now. My email address is on that first slide. We'll be sending this out to all of you in the coming days. So have a good evening.